Welcome to another Sunday morning conversation. So today, my guest is Andrea Hill. And if you follow her on Instagram, she's the fight doctress. She is a ringside fight doc. I had never met one before, and I thought she would be a great person to interview. And I'll probably never end up meeting another one. So she goes by the fight doctress on Instagram. Please stick around for the story. We talk head trauma, suicide, depression. So everything associated with being a prize fighter. Thanks again, everybody.
So I guess, first of all, how did you get to become a fight doctor?
Well, I did it as a favor for a friend. I was training in Muay Thai and married to a retired pro fighter who owned a gym, and there was just a boxing event that didn't have a doctor, and they talked me into doing it. And when I went, I really enjoyed doing it, and then it just kind of grew from there. It was kind of like medicine was fun again. Doing it, you felt like you were doing something useful.
I mean, so these guys are knowingly, essentially wailing on each other's heads, and I'm assuming they've accepted the risk that comes with that. I mean, how does that feel ethically, knowing, yeah, this is what they're going to do to each other?
Well, I mean, a good fighter learns to mount a good defense also. So it's, a lot of fights are won based on points and their strategy to it. And I really see it more as a sport. I mean, risk, yes, but honestly, football has more head injuries and long-term brain damage than combat sports. So, it just kind of depends on how you see it. Personally, because we own gyms and was married to a fighter and I trained in Muay Thai, I see more the sport of it, I guess. I don't see it as, it's not like a street fight. There are rules, and the fighters have to follow the rules, and there's strategy involved and a defense. So, it's I don't really look at it as just a fight, so.
Now, how do knockouts, I guess, affect in the short term and the long term?
Well, there are a couple kinds of knockouts. You can have a brainstem knockout, which is a jerking of the brainstem. And that's a pretty instant knockout, but it doesn't necessarily cause a lot of, injury to the brain. It's more like a crunch on the brainstem and then it's over, if that makes sense. The other kind of knockout is when you have an injury to the brain, and everything just shuts down pretty much. So, I mean, knockouts, of course, by definition, you would assume at minimum it's a concussion, right? And then go from there. But it does differ depending on what type of knockout occurs.
Now, so I guess I've seen a lot of Tyson's fights over the years. Would that be more of a brainstem knockout for people who don't know fighting that well?
For Tyson, when he knocked somebody out, you mean?
Yeah.
No, not necessarily. No.
So you don't really know which one it is until later on.
No, when you get in the ring, so if somebody's had a knockout, a doctor has to assess them. With a brainstem injury, it's more like this feeling like your legs fell out from under you, like you couldn't move, rather than you went unconscious. And you do go unconscious, but it's a flash moment. And so when they come back from a brainstem knockout, lots of times they don't even know they've been knocked out, because it was more like an autonomic reflex than a loss of consciousness. So once you get in and you assess them and find out what all went on, you know the difference as a doctor.
Yeah. I know very little about boxing as a whole. I know you have, your good prize fighters, you have journeyman fighters, and then there's a term that I learned called tomato cans. They're people who should give up a long time ago, but they keep going, I guess.
Right.
Now, for people who would be quote unquote a tomato can, what are the long-term effect of, losing all those fights? And I mean, not all of them are knockouts, but, probably a decent portion of them are. Are they more prone to having like long-term effects?
You know, I haven't seen a specific study, but you know, instinctively you would say yes. Any fighter, you know, when we're talking about long-term effect, usually we're talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and that's not necessarily related to the knockouts that you have. So you can have post-concussion syndrome, you can have acute traumatic encephalopathy, and any fighter risk for that. Any athlete, honestly, who's had recurrent hits to the head of any kind, you don't have to have had the knockouts. So CTE comes from subacute, small, tiny tearing in the blood vessels that usually you feel fine when it occurs. It's not a knockout. So sure, the number of knockouts or additive effect cause an additive effect over time, but it doesn't require knockouts to have that problem. So I think the fighters who are at the most risk for brain issues were ones who either didn't know how to mount a good defense, weren't good at blocking shots, or it's more their fight style, going in head first. There's Canelo, I think, is a great example of a fighter who has great defense. So Canelo's had, gosh, I don't even know how many fights. I think by the time he was 15, he'd had 50 fights. Is something crazy. Like, he's had hundreds of fights.
I've seen his fights where he can dodge and duck and weave like nobody else.
And he blocks his head really well. So that fighting style is probably going to be at less risk for long-term effects, but he doesn't have to knock his opponent out for the opponent to have effects from brain injuries. It really has to do with how well you defend yourself over your career, how strong your neck muscles are, which kind of determines how much shaking of the head is happening. It's a lot of variables like that, rather than just the number of concussions that you've had or number of knockouts.
Have you been at a fight where you've experienced a knockout that was so significant that it was essentially a career ender at that moment?
A career ender.
Yeah.
No, I've never taken care of a brain bleed, knock on wood. Never. That would have to be a brain bleed. A knockout would never necessarily end a career unless there was a significant total brain, traumatic brain injury, a bleed, something like that. Then you'd be out for good.
Now, for someone who doesn't know what punchy means, how would you describe that to someone?
A punch?
No, punchy, like a former fighter is a little bit punchy.
So a fighter who is a little bit punchy is going to be somebody who kind of is, they've been affected and maybe they don't know it. They're a little, their personality is a little different. They're more, and they don't even realize it. So they're like, punchy would be a little bit more like, so signs of head injuries are not just loss of consciousness, but a change in personality, increased anger, things like that can be signs of head injury. So when somebody's punchy, they've had some hits to the head and they're just not acting like their normal selves, and they don't even know it. But they wouldn't be, say, there wouldn't be an alteration in consciousness at all. So if somebody's had a really bad brain injury, I don't know if you've ever watched videos as in Ringside Medicine, we watch videos where things go bad a lot because we have to recognize the signs, hopefully, before something goes bad. So if you've seen some of the fights where a fighter died, they usually look pretty sleepy, so punchy would not be sleepy or any alteration in consciousness, just more edgy, not themselves, not acting right.
Now, like, aggression wouldn't be necessarily associated with that, would it?
It doesn't have to be, but it's a good example of it, just not acting themselves, personality wise.
Now, do they have, would anything like speech slurring have be a symptom of that?
I think are you thinking about the term punch drunk?
I don't know if they're interchangeable or not, because again, it's not particularly my field. I just have a brain injury and I know what I've experienced.
I would not think slurred speech. I think slurred speech goes a step beyond punchy.
Okay. And I had one more question. It's a problem with brain injuries. You tend to forget stuff. Um, I think that's probably it that I have. Um, Thanks, Doc, for sharing a little bit of that wisdom on us today. I've never met a fight doctor. I've only been to one fight, so
Really.
yeah.
They actually take quite a bit of skill. I know to people who aren't used to watching fights and just see it, it might seem brutal, but when you know the training and the skill that has to go into it, I think you can really appreciate the sport in it. And just seeing, the difference between people who get in a street fight and are angry and the sportsmanship that's involved most of the time between fighters in the ring or the cage. It just kind of it's really it's a lot of work. It's hard work for these athletes and a lot of training.
I remember what the last question I had was. Speaking of long-term effects with fighters, you've been in a gym for a while. What do you see with their behavior, their mannerisms, their personalities in fighters who have had a lot of fights that didn't necessarily have a good defense? What are their lives like post-career? I mean, I know with CTE, like in football, suicide is one of those things. I didn't want to touch on that much unless, I didn't know
Right.
how your husband, if he was affected by that. But I
Yeah.
mean, do they experience a lot of those same kind of tendencies that football players do?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Um, uh, Mental health problems, I think, are one of the least recognized long-term complications of head injuries in fighters, especially because when a fighter starts losing their temper and flying into rages, people just assume that's why they were a fighter in the first place. If they have depression, I think when you talk about something like football, American football reaches a wide range of the population. In a wide range of people play football, so you don't have a predisposition towards a certain personality in football. But in fighting, you do have a disproportionate number of people who come from bad homes, who come from a rough life, and they find their place in the gym. So you have personalities that then, when they go on to develop depression or impulsivity, rage, even suicide, a lot of times people just attribute that to who they were as a person in the beginning, instead of recognizing that this is actually a sign of brain injury. So I think in football players, you could have a really popular guy from a great family who didn't have any temper problems end up flying into rages, and people notice that's a difference, right? And they don't assume that that was just his personality in the first place. But in fighters, all too often, I think people say, well, what do you expect from a fighter? Which isn't really entirely true. I mean, it is a sport, but the perception is just not the same as a football player. So when they have mental health problems, they go very unrecognized a lot of the time. And then there's a higher rate of things like substance abuse, as they basically are trying to self-medicate, So, I mean, there are signs that are very obvious to people. So say Muhammad Ali, for example, he had Parkinson's syndrome, not Parkinson's disease. That was from head injuries. And that's very obvious, right? Parkinson's syndrome, it seems very obvious. Or fighters who can't speak in sentences or have slurred speech as they get older, or who forget everything. That's very obvious. But the mental health aspect is much harder to recognize as a brain injury, and the fighters themselves often are going to be less likely to get help because they think, well, everybody always said I was violent, I punched people for a living, I really am a violent person, instead of realizing that they're having problems with impulse control. So I think that's the more challenging part about long-term head injuries in fighters than in some other sports where they have equal or more long-term head injuries. But it's just easier to recognize those kind of symptoms. The psychological symptoms of head injuries are I just believe they're one of the most overlooked things and undertreated things when it comes to head injuries in sports.
So this depression that they face after their career in some instances, I know when I went through my depression after my TBI, I did ketamine therapy before it was FDA approved. Do you know many fighters that have tried that and see if it had helped them?
No, I would say most fighters don't get much help at all. They usually don't have insurance, and the mentality of a fighter is that I'm tough enough to do this myself. So it's the rare person who actually seeks out any kind of treatment.
So most fighters have trouble asking for help or even recognizing that they need it.
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. Well, Doc, thanks for coming on with me today. I appreciate
Yep.
it.
Yeah, no problem. You have a great day, Eric.
Thanks, guys, for watching another Sunday morning conversation. If you liked what you saw, please do like and subscribe. And if you want to see more of them, click the little bell notification and it'll tell you whenever I post another one. Thanks again, guys.